Interesting quotes that I've seen in your book that I marked that I wanted to talk to you about. One was on page 46 where you say, in an early clash between a black and a white feminist, anti-lynching crusader, Ida B. Wells opposed the views of Frances Willard, a suffragette pioneer who advocated lynching. Then the next page you go on to say, feminist hero Elizabeth Cady Stanton offended Frederick Douglass. An abolitionist woman attempted to prevent his daughter from gaining entrance to a girls' school when she referred to black men as Sambos. She was an unabashed white supremacist. She said in 1867, quote, with the black man we have no new element in government, but with the education and elevation of women we have power, that is to develop the Saxon race into a higher and nobler life. Why did you include these two quotes, and what exactly, what context and point were you making in your book, Barack Obama and the Jim Crow Media, The Return of the Nigger Breaker?
Well, I was pointing to Gloria Steinem's op-ed in the New York Times where she said that gender was the most restrictive factor in American life. And she went on to talk about how African-American men achieved the vote before women. What she didn't mention was that was only in theory because they had a difficult time in the 19th century to exercise the vote. And I talk about African-American men being massacred or lynched when they tried to vote, and how, you know, they were expelled from their positions as politicians or office holders during that period. Now, you hear the same kind of echoes today where white middle-class feminists who believe that that gender is the most restrictive factor in American life, putting the rape smear on African-American men. For example, the woman who wrote Vagina Monologues, she said recently that the only thing that united the Congo with Haiti and New Orleans was rape. Now, even the New York Times, which is not friendly to African-American people, I mean, every day you get a mug shot of somebody in trouble, asserted that the reports of widespread rape and, you know, certain myths about what happened in the wake of Katrina were not true. And one of those who was responsible for spreading these myths was the correspondent for CNN at the time, Jeff Kanaje, who was revealed to be someone who made up things, who fabricated things. When he went to Africa, he was exposed as someone who put out this fib that people in Zimbabwe dying on rats or something like that. I mean, he finally got fired by CNN. But I mean, this is the kind of myth that is picked up by the middle-class feminists like this woman, and you know, used to indict African-American men. As a result, because of this drubbing that African-American men receive from the middle-class white feminist movement, which has been criticized by black women for over 100 years. You know, he's going back to, I mean, you know, for 100 years, but their opinions don't count. You seldom hear anybody taking their opinions seriously. But, you know, this has done a lot to diminish the effectiveness of African-American men on the left. Where would the counterculture be without African-American men? Where would the counterculture be or the left be without people like Huey Newton or Bobby Seale or H. Rap Brown or Stokely Carmichael or Martin Luther King, Malcolm X? I can go on and on. So a movement that's dominated by people like this thinker, this writer, is doomed to fail because it exalts one gender over the other. And I think that's a losing proposition.
Now, can you speak more specifically to the Ida B. Wells and Frances Willard quote that I read?
Yeah, well, Ida B. Wells was a anti-lynching crusader who had the audacity to write that some of the women who were crying rape in the South were actually in consensual relationships with black men, and for that she had to leave Memphis. And there's also a hoax, I would call it, a media hoax that's resurfaced, that the black men who were lynched during the period of Ida B. Wells' period were guilty. This is somebody said that recently. It's like almost as ludicrous as some feminists calling Scarlett O'Hara, a slave owner, a feminist hero, or shiro. But the people who were lynched in Memphis at the time were actually productive businessmen, and they ran up against the competition or the envy of white businessmen, and that's why they were lynched. Many times in American history, African Americans have been driven from whole towns, banished, or lynched because they were too successful. That happened to one of my early mentors, A.J. Smitherman. When I was a kid, around 16. I worked in the printing office owned by A.J. Smitherman, who was a publisher of the Empire Star. At the time, I didn't know that he was one of the leading citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that he was advocating self-defense, militant self-defense against lynching. And for his efforts, he was indicted for sedition when the Tulsa riots happened in 1921. He had to leave town. His whole family. He was ruined. But one of the reasons that the mob went after him was because he was prosperous.
Let me read this other quote to you. This was another very important topic that I wanted to talk to you about in a book, and that I thought was interesting, is you put together a pretty accurate criticism of the racist media and their coverage of Obama. Also, you had some very poignant criticisms of Obama yourself. And here's one quote. This is on page 104. The talking heads also concluded that Obama's speech before a black congregation, in which he scolded black men for being lousy fathers and missing in action from single-parent household and being boys, etc., was clearly aimed at those white male Reagan Democrats who apparently, in Obama's and the media's eyes, provide the gold standard for fatherhood, which fails to explain why there are millions of destitute white women, quote-unquote displaced housewives, and their children whose poverty results from divorce, or why, according to one study, 90% of middle-class white women have been battered or have witnessed their mothers, sisters, or daughters being battered. Then you go on the next page and say, predictably, Obama's verbal flagellation of black men who don't have the media power with which to fight back was cheered on the front page of the New York Times, which places a black face on every story about welfare, domestic violence, and unmarried mothers, and uses Orlando Patterson to parrot these attitudes on the op-ed page. Yet a study published by the Times showed a steep decline in the rate of births to unmarried black women over the decade, while the rate among Hispanic women has increased, contradicting what Cohen described as a quote-unquote epidemic of illegitimacy among blacks. Can you talk a little bit about those two quotes?
Yeah, well, the birth rate among unmarried black women had declined steeply since 1976. One study said it was that the unmarried birth rates among unmarried black women have plummeted more than any other ethnic groups. Now, what we have now, according to recent statistics, is that there are more Hispanic births out of wedlock, if you want to use a term like that. There are more Hispanic births per thousand than African American births. But there's a whole industry of op-ed writers, public intellectuals. They seem to be all in the African American Studies Department at Harvard, who thrive on slandering African American women. One of them at Harvard said that talked about 35-year-old grandmothers living in the projects. And when I mentioned Bill Cosby, who was a friend of mine, was part of this effort to defame African American women, he wrote me an email criticizing the point, but he doesn't have the facts. Multi-generational welfare receivers are rare. I confronted one of the writers for the Times who always puts a black face on welfare and mentioned other groups like, for example, Vietnamese Americans are having difficulty because of the five-year limit imposed by the Clinton's Welfare Reform Act. they're having difficulty. Other groups, Russian Jews, and, Hispanics, Asian Americans. I mean, they all see Asian Americans as valedictorians, but they don't read Asian Week. You go read Asian Week, and you'll see that there's poverty in certain Asian American communities among Filipino, Southeast Asian immigrants. They blame the whole thing on African Americans. So what I find is that I've accepted some of these myths. It's very easy if you're bombarded with them. I grew up in a middle class household where welfare recipients were criticized and mocked, but there was a change in my viewpoint in the 90s when somebody challenged me to reply to Pete Hamill's piece in the Esquire talking about black pathology. I went out and looked up the facts, and I think a lot of people labor on these myths. For example, there was an article by the House Conservative at the New York Times. They hired this guy to get red state subscribers, and he said there's white anxiety over affirmative action. Well, most of the people who benefit from affirmative action are white women. Julian Bond had to write yet another letter reminding him of that. For example, Sandra Day O'Connor, he quoted her letter where she said that because this guy was talking about there should be limits or there should be a timetable on affirmative action. It should be phased out. He reminded her that Sandra Day O'Connor said that there shouldn't be a timetable for women, meaning white women, until they reach 50%. Now, in the universities, they're over 50%. While African-American men and Hispanic men are in prison, white women are over 50% in the universities now as enrollees. And so this idea that gender is the most restrictive factor in American life, or sexual orientation. See, what's happening now on the left is that it's being dominated by white middle-class people who said they're more oppressed than blacks or more oppressed than poor people. And the issues that they're concerned about might be considered latte issues if you're among the 40 million people who are starving. If you don't have enough food to eat, you're not really concerned about gay marriage. And I'm not against gay marriage. I think people, if they want to get married, that's fine. Matter of fact, African Americans should support gay marriage because this issue is sapping up all the oxygen on the left when there are other issues that are important too. So the 40 million people and living in the ghettos and Appalachia, they think Appalachia is the only place where there's white poverty. There's white poverty all over the country. Texas, the South, which is still treated as a third world nation, especially South Carolina, Alaska, places like that. I've been around. There are trailer parks all the way from Oakland. If you go take the train from Oakland to Reno, you'll find trailer park city. So I mean, they hide all these white people on the Jerry Springer show and places like that. Or there's a very well-known a movie maker who addresses this in, for example, Winter in the Bone. I think that's the title of it. Anyways, playing that on Shattuck Avenue, Down to the Bone. She's done 2 movies that show white people in heroin addiction who are working upstate in low-paying jobs like grocery clerks and things. We don't get that kind of aspect of life. So I mean, if you're up against it like that, then these issues on the left are considered probably latte issues.
Can you talk a little bit about Obama playing the media and downing black fathers to win points with who you say are Reagan Democrats?
Yeah, well, they congratulated him for that. But when Bristol Palin, her being unmarried and having a child, when that happened, we got a rare glimpse behind what I call a suburban mall curtain, where these guys were trying to excuse that on Joe Scarborough's show. I think mostly Irish American or Scots Irish. I think there's sort of like an Irish American mafioso thing, or they're sort of clustered around that hour on these talk shows. One guy said, "Well, that happens in every family." I said, "Wow." The out of birth rate among white women has soared. You don't hear about that because of the population crisis, where whites are not reproducing themselves. In Europe, this is a real problem. In Germany, there's almost zero birth rate. When I was in Vienna a couple of years ago, I told some newspaper people there that Europe was becoming a dark continent again. So you find a rare glimpse into, and you mentioned violence committed against white women by white men. I don't understand why this is not a big issue for this lady, for example, who did the vagina monologues, who believes all the rape and all the evil against women happens in the Congo or in Haiti or in New Orleans. Why she doesn't tackle that? I suspect that she gets grants from white men. I mean, we don't have the payroll to pay some of these women. I guess that's why they use African American men to vent all their frustrations against men for misogyny and all this kind of stuff. But if one study, this SUNY Buffalo study, said that 90% of these white women who were interviewed said they'd been abused or battered or seen their mothers abused or battered, or sisters or daughters, then most of the violence in this country is taking place in the suburbs. But as long as white men are the mediators, and in the progressive media, because David Corn of The Nation also congratulated Obama for his critique of what he called the black family, as long as they're the referees, we're not going to hear about how they treat women, and nobody's going to do a theater piece about it or a movie about it. Now,
why do you think Obama is playing into this?
He was trying to win votes. I mean, the same reason Clinton did it. Clinton did the same thing when he did the Sister Soldier stunt. When he went to Jesse Jackson's Push convention and got up there and criticized this hip-hop singer, his poll numbers went up in the South. And Willie Horton, when Bush played the Willie Horton card, his poll numbers went up. So, running against black people gets you a constituency among, white voters. So he did that. Recently, he said that he didn't just mean black men. I guess the criticism got to him. But Obama's all we got. I suspect that a lot of the criticism that he gets from the progressive media is because traditionally progressives have not been able to accept black leadership. That's why they got purged from SNCC. Because they were trying to run the show and not taking the risk.